34, the printed calendar, bill been taken by temporarily Delegate Simons. House Bill 263 is before the body. It is a bill to amend the Code of Virginia relating to public financing of elections, the Virginia Democracy Voucher Program. The bill is reported to the Committee on Rules without recommendation.
Mr. Speaker.
Delegate from Charlottesville, Delegate Toscano.
Parliamentary inquiry.
Delegate may state it.
Mr. Speaker, I'd ask the Speaker if we read Article 4, Section 11 of the Virginia Constitution, which says that no law shall be enacted except by bill, and no bill shall become a law unless it's been referred to a committee, considered, and reported. Would it be your position that a bill can only be considered before this body if it has been considered first by a properly constituted committee of this body?
I would say the Rules Committee, it was considered by, and that's certainly a properly constituted committee.
Mr. Speaker, point of order.
Delegate may state it.
I think I understand your ruling to be that it does require a properly constituted committee to hear a bill before it comes to this floor. Under the strict interpretation of the words of Rule 16 of the House, the Rules Committee is to have 16 members, and under 16A of the House rules, the committee membership is to be proportional, and there is no carve-out under the rules for the Rules Committee to be anything but proportional, and we know it is not proportional. Now, we've known about this problem for weeks, and there have been no rules changes brought to the floor to fix that problem. And so I would consequently ask, as a point of order, whether the Rules Committee has been improperly constituted and therefore the actions of it are arguably not properly before this body.
I remind the delegate that I wrote a letter to the effect that that's been the custom and practice of the House, and I so rule.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You want to explain? Okay, go ahead.
Delegate Simon.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, House Bill 263 is the Virginia Democracy Voucher Program. It's a program for the public financing of elections in Virginia. I was a little surprised that you guys gave me the opportunity to present this bill here on the floor. And so I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about what this bill does, the problem that it's trying to solve first, sort of using the chairman from, of course, he says, you know, what is the bill trying to solve and how does your bill solve it, and tell us whether we should vote for your bill. So I'm going to go ahead and, since we didn't have the opportunity to do this in committee, get into it a little bit. The problem that we're trying to solve, frankly, is that we've got a system for financing our elections here in Virginia that a lot of people find suspect, draws a lot of our actions into question. We've got a lot of money in politics that comes from really the interests that we're here to regulate and legislate about. And you know, I know to a lot of folks the Democracy Voucher Program sounds kind of wacky. It came from Seattle. What is this all about? It's mailing people $100 vouchers for campaign finance. But I think if you were to describe, if you were starting from scratch and describe the campaign finance system that we actually use here in Virginia, I think a lot of people would say that sounds pretty wacky too. What happens is we divide ourselves up into committees, and then we regulate industries like the beer and wine industry, the medical industry. We got dentists, doctors, everybody that we regulate. We divide up our committees, and then we let them finance our campaigns. We say to all the people that we're going to regulate, you guys will fund our campaign coffers, and you'll elect whoever, you'll help elect the folks that you want, and then we'll come to Richmond on the backs of your campaign contributions, and we will regulate you. To a lot of people, that sounds like a weird way to finance a state election system. And, you know, it's interesting looking at just the members of the Rules Committee. I mean, anybody can go to VPAP, and you can pull up the 2017, and you just look for the list of top donors, and it reads like a who's who of the companies that we regulate. We've got the Medical Society of Virginia giving tens of thousands of dollars. We've got HCA Virginia. We've got the dentists. We've got the medical society. I guess maybe there's a big issue that we're going to be deciding this year that has to do with those medical, maybe it's Medicaid expansion those folks are interested in. You look at the chairman of Commerce and Labor, get a big donation from Appalachian Power and from Dominion Power. And it causes folks to look at what we do and wonder who it is that we're working for.
Mr. Speaker.
Delegate Freitas.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Gentleman, would the delegate yield for a question?
No, not this time, Mr. Speaker.
Delegate declines to yield.
So, Mr. Speaker, that's the problem that we're trying to solve. We want to have a system of campaign finance that people can believe in, a system that people can have some faith in, a system that doesn't at least create the appearance that we don't have the best interest of our constituents and the people in mind. And so you may not like this particular solution. You may look at some of the details here when we get into it a little bit and think this isn't the way that we want to go. It's too expensive. It doesn't work. There are problems with it. And if you don't like this particular solution, I don't take any offense to anybody who decides that they don't want to vote for this bill. But what we would do is, and this has been tried other places, it's not a brand new thing. What we would do is this bill would say that everybody on the first day of every election year, the Department of Elections is going to mail you 4 vouchers of $25 each. And they are going to be democracy vouchers. And they're going to say that, by the way, it says right on the voucher, this voucher is only redeemable for an election, and it's only redeemable to the extent that there are funds available for it. So if the program funds don't exist, it doesn't create any liability to the Treasury for vouchers to the extent they exceed the amount of the program. Now, I know, again, when you say that, well, there's 5 million registered voters or so in Virginia. It's $100 each. This is going to cost us $500 million.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Delegate from Charlottesville, delegate.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
I'll yield.
Yield for a question. The delegate yields.
Oh, we're not playing by the script. I'm sorry.
Mr. Speaker, I'd ask the gentleman, I've heard a lot about the committee system and the importance of the committee system, and I've heard a lot about the importance of the Rules Committee considering weighty issues such as this one. Can the gentleman tell me that whether before this bill was reported out here to the floor, was there any discussion whatsoever, the bill, its merits, its cost, or anything related to this bill?
Mr. Speaker, I would respond to the gentleman that I briefly presented the bill. Being in front of the Rules Committee, I thought that it was about to be re-referred to the Privileges and Elections Committee, perhaps, or maybe to Appropriations because of its fiscal impact. So I gave a brief presentation expecting to hear some questions, but no, there were none. In fact, just the motion to refer it to the floor without a recommendation.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield for an additional question?
I'll yield.
Will the delegate, slow down a little bit. Will the delegate yield for another question?
I'll yield.
Delegate yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask the gentleman, you mentioned a figure about a fiscal impact, and I heard a huge number, but I also was able to get a copy of a fiscal impact review from JLARC that came to us before the Rules Committee even looked at this bill, and it's a pretty hefty impact. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would answer the gentleman that it is a fairly substantial income. They estimate that it would be, I think, maybe $10 to $14 million. So not the 500 figure. They kind of run the numbers. There are spending limits on each campaign, and if you did the math, sort of the worst case scenario that they could come up with was about 10 to 14 million. But that's still, yes, a substantial amount of money.
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion.
Delegate may state it.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, it's the usual and customary practice of this body, and we value custom and practice, that a bill like this that has a fiscal impact of at least $10 million ought to be referred to the Committee on Appropriations. And so therefore, I would make a motion under usual custom and practice that we so value in this body to move this bill and refer it to the Committee on Appropriations.
Mr. Speaker.
Delegate from Shenandoah, Delegate Gilbert.
Speaking to the motion.
Delegate has the floor.
Of course, we make exception to those rules when it's such an impactful legislation such as this, Mr. Speaker. And I think we have the opportunity right here and now to debate the merits of this bill right along here with the members of our Appropriations Committee to give it its due attention. So I would encourage the members to defeat the motion to refer the bill to Appropriations.
Shall House Bill 263 be referred to the Committee on Appropriations? All those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. Ayes and nays. Shall the bill be referred to
Mr. Speaker,
delegate from Shenandoah, Delegate Gilbert?
may the House be at ease for a moment.
House is at ease.
Mr. Speaker?
Right. Shall the bill be referred to the Committee on Appropriations? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 48, noes 50.
Ayes 48, noes 50. The bill will not be referred to appropriations. Delegate from Culpeper, Delegate Freitas.
Will the delegate now yield for a question?
Will the delegate from Fairfax yield for a question?
I'll yield for a question, sure.
Delegate yields.
Mr. Speaker, I'm curious because as I was reading through this bill, it looks like this only applies to state candidates. So the governor, lieutenant governor, House delegate, state senate. Is that correct, Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, I would state that that is the way I read the bill as well.
Will the delegate yield for another question?
Delegate yield for another question.
I'll yield.
Delegate yields.
Does the delegate think that perhaps Senator Kaine would sign on to such an important piece of legislation?
Mr. Speaker, I think that if you were to sign a similar pledge, perhaps he would, but I'm not authorized to speak for the senator.
Mr. Speaker, will the delegate yield for another question?
Will the delegate yield for another question?
I'll yield.
Delegate yields.
I understand that the delegate is obviously concerned with the amount of money that we have in politics, and I'm sure that that's a concern that's shared by many. The question I have, though, is that this particular process is using tax dollars now to fund political campaigns. Is the gentleman worried at all that instead of people voluntarily giving of their money in order to fund campaigns, we're now going to forcefully confiscate their money and then give it back with the contingency that they then have to give it back to us in some sort of form? Is the gentleman at all concerned about the equity of such a process?
So, Mr. Speaker, I would answer the gentleman that I think that we use taxpayer dollars to pay for all kinds of worthwhile and valuable things in our society. And so there is an element of confiscation in taxation. It's not a voluntary system. We all do it under the threat of being arrested and thrown in jail. So that's why we pay our taxes. And we pay for things that we think have a value to the community at large and improve the way we do things. Our salaries are paid for by taxpayers. We have expense accounts that are paid for by taxpayers. We come and study on commissions. We get $300 a day of confiscated money that's returned to us so that we can do our jobs better. And so I don't really see this as being all that different. I think that if you were to ask a lot of my constituents, are they willing to pay a little more in taxes to have a campaign system that they can believe in, a campaign system that involves a broader spectrum that allows people, regardless of their income, to participate in that campaign finance process, one that relies on small donations, one that actually requires people that want to participate in that process to give up corporate money, to adhere to spending limits, and adhere to a higher standard, which, by the way, includes a limitation. You can't spend your voucher money on personal use, a restriction we don't currently have on taxpayer funds. So I think if you ask my constituents and folks in my area if they'd be willing to pay some taxes to have a system that worked better and that created more integrity in the system, I think that most of them would say that was a good deal, and they would take that bargain.
I think the
I know, Luke.
delegate, speaking to the bill at the appropriate time.
Delegate from Fauquier, Delegate Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Will the delegate yield for a question?
I'll yield.
Delegate yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in regards to this legislation, I would ask the gentleman, what if a candidate did not want to partake and decided he wanted to self-fund his own campaign, and his own campaign happened to be significantly funded?
Mr. Speaker, I would answer the gentleman, this is a voluntary program. Nobody has to participate in it. You don't have to take the vouchers if you don't want to. I expect that a lot of existing incumbents would opt out of the program. They're doing pretty well under the existing system, and so they might say, no, thank you. I'm going to keep doing things the old way. And if you're actually running against somebody who's opted out of the system, we have a fix for that too. You can actually seek to be released. So if you get into the system, you want to volunteer and do the voucher program and voluntarily adhere to the spending limits, and you're up against an opponent who's greatly outspending you, there's a mechanism to go to the State Board of Elections, say, I'd like to be released from the program, I won't take any more vouchers, and I want to start raising money the old-fashioned way. And if that's the case, you'll be allowed to do that. So you could absolutely do that. There's nothing compulsory about the program. I thank the gentleman for the question.
Further question, Mr. Speaker?
The delegate yield for another question.
I'll yield.
Delegate yield.
So as I understand the legislation as he describes it, if I am in the program and I am running against a candidate like Governor Northam, who received $2.7 million from the League of Conservation Voters, I can then opt out and go about the old system to raise money?
I would tell the gentleman he's absolutely correct.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Delegate from Virginia Beach, Delegate Davis.
Mr. Speaker, will the delegate yield for a question?
Will the delegate yield for a question?
The patron of the bill.
Yeah. Delegate Simon. Delegate yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask the delegate that he's expressed that we need and we deserve a campaign system that we can all believe in with trust and transparency, but yet he limits this just to statewide candidates, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general. Does he not believe that if this is the way to get transparent government campaigns that we can all believe in, that is not something that we should offer at the House of Delegates, State Senate, City Council levels? Why does he not believe that that same opportunity should be afforded to those races as well for the citizens?
Mr. Speaker, you have to give me a second. I thought, I don't know which version he's looking at, but I thought, and there's been a couple of different versions of this bill that I had drafted. I thought this bill did apply to House of Delegates and State Senate races. In fact, I'm fairly certain that it does. On line 18.
Clarification, Mr. Speaker? I mean the local ones. I understand the House of Delegates may be included in there, but the local city councils, mayors, board of supervisors.
Mr. Speaker, I'd answer the gentleman that if he'd like to do that, he ought to get his own bill.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
All three of us.
Whoa.
Sam.
I'm down. Make sure you're hitting you like Doug from Culpeper, Delegate Freitas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, speaking to the bill.
Delegate has the floor.
Again, I think Delegate Simon said a couple things were fairly interested. He said he thinks that his constituents be willing to pay more in taxes for this. Well, that's wonderful. I don't think my constituents would be. And he said that this is a voluntary program. Yes, it's a voluntary program if you're a candidate. It's not a voluntary program if you're a taxpayer. He's going to take the money anyways. And again, yes, we do take taxpayer money in order to spend money on things that the delegate thinks is worthwhile, and we come here and we have that debate on what constitutes as worthwhile. I'm thrilled that the delegate believes that his own reelection is a worthwhile cause for the taxpayers to chip in. But again, the taxpayers already have an ability to do that. It's called through voluntarily handing money over in the form of campaign contributions, and I don't think this body should be involved in confiscating their money in order to give it back to them under the auspices of you will now spend it on a campaign. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Delegate from Charlottesville, Delegate Toscano.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the bill.
Delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's time to bring this debate to an end. And with it, I might just emphasize to the body the words usual and customary, because we know what's happened here today is it by no means usual and customary, and it's just a charade so that people can make speeches about public financing of campaigns. That's all that this is about. And for folks to be able to be willing to take the body's time to engage in this charade. That's a UVA education. But think about it here. This is a really important issue. And like a lot of really important issues we've discussed in this session, like health care, we have tossed around a number of ideas to try to address it. And think about these significant health care bills that have been sent to various committees where we thought, we've debated, we've discussed, we've amended. And then as the committees did their work, they brought those bills to the floor. This is an important issue. The delegate has an interesting idea. It should have gone to a committee. Well, it actually should have gone to the Privileges and Elections Committee. But for some reason, the exalted status of the Rules Committee made it a place for it to go. Granted, that's a great place to have the argument about this because it's a big issue. But what does the Rules Committee do? They punt. And they punt this right to the floor. You know, there was another bill that the delegate had offered, a bill, really simple bill that said this, that we weren't going to use campaign funds for personal expenses. Just a little bitty bill that both gubernatorial candidates embraced, a little bitty bill that the Republican caucus embraced, and we can't get it out of committee to get it to the floor. What's going on here? It's a charade. So you look at campaign finance is reasonable, but you have to discuss it. I would encourage the body to think about also the fact that usual and customary procedure is to refer anything that has a fiscal impact on appropriations. No, that doesn't happen either here because people want to make their campaign speeches. Good. We've got it on video. It's great. But now we got to get with the bill. Deal with the bill. This bill is not ready. This is an idea. It's not ready. And as my esteemed colleague from Salem says, we don't vote on ideas. We vote on the words. So I would encourage you to compliment the delegate from Fairfax from bringing forward a really unique idea that we can then take back and think about. But for now, it's not ready. So I think we should all vote no and move and do the rest of the people's business. Thank you.
Delegate from Shenandoah, Delegate Gilbert.
Speaking to the bill, Mr. Speaker.
Delegate has the floor.
So, Mr. Speaker, citizens of Virginia, this is what happens when the public policy of Seattle is very close to becoming the public policy of Virginia. And there's a lot of words. It's nearly 100 lines of italicized new words. And the gentleman from Charlottesville is right. We don't pass concepts. But this appears to be a very well thought out, elaborate concept by somebody, at least in terms of what they think is important. But the people who wrote this bill, wherever they wrote it, must certainly struggle with how to fund everything else that they're supposed to do as a government, like think about how to get raises to our teachers and how to make sure we have enough state police and the environment and K through 12 education and keeping tuition low and all the other things we have to grapple with in this body year in, year out to make sure that we are delivering services to the public for the tax dollars they pay. And I'm sure that they don't intend to do it like they do it in Seattle. And Mr. Speaker, the Department of Planning and Budget fiscal impact statement on this bill says that if only 2 participating candidates redeeming vouchers for the maximum total spending limit for primary and general elections and only the minimum amount of qualifying contributions, then a total of $31.6 million would qualify for redemption under the program. That seems to be the floor, not the ceiling of what this could do in terms of impacting our budget. That doesn't include the fixed cost of implementing the program. I agree it's not well thought out. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be discussing it here, because these types of ideas, somebody thought that this was a great idea for public policy in Virginia and submitted it as a piece of legislation. And I think it's important for us to discuss things like that here on the floor. And I think it's important for the constituency groups that are regularly coming and sitting in our office every morning and every afternoon, telling us why they do not have the resources necessary to carry out their mission. I think it's important for them to see what types of public policy are being brought forth here in this body. So I'll join with the delegate from Charlottesville in asking you to defeat this legislation.
Delegate from Fairfax, Delegate Hugo.
Mr. Speaker, speak to the motion.
Delegate has the floor.
Well, I would think one thing the minority leader is just incorrect when he talks about how we handle bills around here. I think the chairman of finance can say just a couple days ago, we had one of the minority leader's bills we're considering sending straight to the floor off finance. It had a fiscal impact, and it's not going to go to appropriations. Sorry, I don't remember that. But more importantly, we have a lot of important things to debate here this year. We have needs in the Commonwealth. We have needs for roads. We're talking about metro. We're talking about transit. We're talking about ports. We have a lot of needs for schools, high school, elementary, colleges. We're going to talk about medicine, Medicare, Medicaid. But what we're wasting our time today, because the gentleman brought this here, is we're talking about diverting money from schools. We're talking about diverting money from roads. We're talking about diverting money from transit. And we're talking about diverting money from Medicaid to give it to people's campaigns. I say what we should do is go forward, say yes to schools, say yes to roads, say yes to police, say yes to transit, and say no to welfare for politicians. Let's defeat this measure.
Delegate from Fairfax, Delegate Simon.
So I'll be brief, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker. We bring ideas here that take a while to work out, that take a multi-year process. I'll go back again to my ban on personal use. It's gone through a multi-year process. That's normally how we do things. Second of all, if this had gone, if this bill passed in exactly its form that it is today off this floor, it would cost $0.00 because it says right in the bill, it's subject to the availability of program funds. So as it's written, if it doesn't go to appropriations and nobody appropriates any money for it, it doesn't cost anything, and it's not ready. And I've enjoyed, again, the time to speak with you that I didn't ask for, but was given to me. And I hope that you all defeat the bill, and I'll vote yes.
The delegate does need to make the engrossment motion because we really don't have anything in front of us, and it is your bill.
I hope it will be the pleasure of the House to engross the bill and pass it to its third reading.
And before we vote on that motion, I want to elaborate on the ruling I made on this bill. I hope you'll listen carefully. Since 2002, the House Rules Committee has been constituted beyond the parameters of true proportionality by allowing the Speaker to not be counted in the proportionality ratio. The makeup of the current Rules Committee continues along this custom of providing a varying formula for this unique committee. More specifically, the Rules Committee presently reflects the unprecedented and wide-ranging pre-session agreement negotiated across the aisle and approved by both the House Democratic leader and myself. Let me quote the response that I gave in my letter. As you noted in your letter, and no doubt recall, you and I agreed to the specific makeup of the House Committee on Rules as part of the organizational agreement. As also noted in your letter, I have said many times the House Rule and Proportional Committee makeup by custom and practice does not apply to the Rules Committee. So I think that elaboration was necessary. So once again, I so rule. So I think the motion we have is to engross the bill and pass it to its third reading. All in favor of that motion signify. Okay, ayes and nays are called for. Shall the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 2, noes 95.
Ayes 2, noes 95. That's a loyal seatmate. The bill has failed to be engrossed.